Thumbs up. Great. Okay. Well, I'm Nick Enfield. I'm at the University of Sydney. I'm here in linguistics, but I'm kind of engaged with anthropology and cognitive science and various kind of things that are connected to linguistics itself. And I've been thinking in evolutionary terms for a long time about language change, not so much the evolution of language in our species, but a kind of cultural evolution way of thinking about how language changes and how it is learned. So I've been working on a paper with this title for a while, and I'm not really presenting a paper as such. It's not kind of in that state, but this is more just trying to get out a few concepts that I think are relevant to this group and that I kind of want to have on the table in terms of talking about how culture evolves. And so I want to say that conjecture is an important piece of it. I think that in Sage's talk the other day, there was what was the terminology? Inferential reconstruction, maybe something like that. So inference would be another way of kind of glossing it. So here's something, an object, an item, a little piece of technology or culture. And if you show this to people, some of you will know it if you've read the book that it comes from. Some of you may actually have one, know what it is. But a lot of people can't tell from looking at this thing what it is. And there's something quite important as a demonstration here. So I think there are interesting things people can tell by looking at it, but lots of things they can't tell. So we won't do a discussion about this now, but in class, this kind of object leads to a lot of really interesting discussion, which is telling for later. But we will come back to this a little bit later. So I just want to start with the kind of classic way of thinking about meaning. And this is, you go back to Saussure's book on the course in general linguistics. He starts out with this kind of idea of what a sign is. A sign, is a sound. I'm just talking about language now, is a sound or visual sign, if you like, that stands for some kind of object, like a thing or a concept. So the terminology there is a signifier and a signified. So he gives this little diagram. His example is a tree. Our example is a scalpel. At the top, one half of the sign is the sound of the word, and the other half is some kind of concept, however you want to define that. So this is a sort of classical way of thinking about linguistic meaning, which I refer to as the O axis, just mnemonically linking to the object here. But of course, there's another way of thinking about what a word is, and that is looking at what it does and how it's used and what responses it gets in context. So you go to a operating theater, a surgeon says scalpel, and what you can do is measure, well, what's the response that it gets? The response that it gets likely is that somebody hands a scalpel to the person who said the word. So you can take this different view, which is, what I want to call the I-axis, which is the axis of response, an action that responds to the use of some kind of sign or something that's been introduced into the environment. And I stands for interpretant. So this is taking Peircean terminology here, where an interpretant is a response that is, it's a kind of a rational or reasoned response in some sense, which we'll get to. But it's it has this temporal kind of trajectory there. And this is really important to the view that I have of how meaning works and ultimately how cultural evolution works, which is because there's this kind of seesawing or hinging kind of system where I've depicted here on the screen. So a sign gives rise to an interpretant in one frame. And then once the interpretant is produced, then that is a sign in the next frame. So then it can get interpreted next and so on. So every sort of interpretant is, not every, because there are ones that are kind of limited to the inside of your head in a sense. But when any kind of response is public, then it becomes a sign that can then be responded to in turn. And that's really important for what we call result tracking, which is a term we'll come back to in cultural evolution. But in this example, surgeon says scalpel, assistant hands a lancet. So the interpretant of the action is to hand this object, and so therefore it's evidence for the original person who said the word of how that was understood. So either they've grabbed the wrong tool, or they've misunderstood, or they don't know what a scalpel is, whatever. And this gives the opportunity to correct in that third move you see there, and then we receive the correct thing. So that's a kind of I guess you could frame that as a kind of reinforcement. You could frame that as well, I think of it as kind of result tracking. And this is something we see in language. So I've done a fair bit of work with colleagues on repair strategies in language use in interaction. So you can take an example like this one on the screen. Person says, do you know who's going to be at the party? Response is, who? And this was not what was intended. They weren't doing this with this kind of question. You can say that as a prompt, and the person says who, and then I tell you who's going to the party. But in this case, it was just actually a question. So this type of repair happens when you get first move being ambiguous. So this first line here, do you know who's going to the party, could either be an I'm just asking you the information, or it could be a setting you up to be told. And the key thing here is that in this response line, this second line here, the interpretation, the effect of the first line is revealed, is disclosed in the interaction. And this is giving information to the person who went first, and then they immediately have the chance to correct. So you could frame that in terms of sort of reinforcement. You could look at it in terms of result tracking. You could look at it in terms of success tracking and so on. What's important, though, is that the interpretation that is embodied in a reaction points to the kind of underlying concept that the original sign was kind of standing for. So this is how I kind of represent that, is through combining this O-axis and I-axis together. So this is from a 2022 paper where I'm trying to say here that, yes, we're talking here about words. That words have meanings, they have conceptual contents in some sense. So people who do kind of semantics are not on the wrong track or anything. That, it's an important thing to do to think about what words mean. But they can't do that without also thinking about what effects words have in the world in interaction, because those effects are simultaneously, caused by the words, but also evidence for what the words kind of contain in some sense. So this diagram here is really just a way of putting the kind of Peircean three-part semiotic process. So what you basically have in that process is a sign, which stands for an object, which we would say here is kind of, let's say, the meaning of a word, the concept or the thing that is referred to by the word. And the sign gives rise to an interpretant, that is the response to the sign. And the interpretant only makes sense insofar as it also points to what that sign stands for. So there's a kind of it's a complex set of relationships here. It's something that I've tried to kind of unpack in previous work. So this 2013 book has got a chapter that kind of pulls this apart. And I think in this context, for this group, I wanted to kind of put this out here because to me, it's a crucial way of resolving this problem. That is Chomsky's kind of objections to Skinner. In his review, he has this various ways of saying basically the same thing. He has the example of a red chair, and he complains that, if I say red, then you're going to tell me this was a response to the, that red was the stimulus. But if I say chair, you're going to say the chair was the stimulus. And, we can only actually resolve that by somehow going back into the mind of the people involved. And I think that's partly true. But I think the way that we also can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, that is, and we really need to have that sign interpretant axis as well. Why? Because the sign, interpret, and axis that's above this gray line, so you see this line that I've got in the middle of the diagram, what that symbolizes is that what's above that line is public. What's above that line, it can be observed. It's signs and it's responses to signs. So we can observe how people respond to words. We can observe how people use artifacts, and so forth. So that's all observable. But below the line is the realm of hypothesis. It's the realm of conjecture. It's the realm of inference. And you can only see evidence of hypothesis and conjecture and inference in signs and interpretants. So I've started calling this so in Peirce, it's referred to as an object. I've been calling it a conject in the sense that what I think is important about this idea is that it is conjecture. You never really know what other people think a word means. You never really know what other people's understanding of the world is, but you only get it by the evidence in signs and interpretants. Okay, so the puzzle that kind of comes up then is, a big kind of piece of trying to understand how culture comes about, and I include in that kind of language. It has to be learned, and people have to be able to get from signs. If they're going to learn, for example, words, they've got to be able to get from the visible signs that are used to this kind of sign-object relation. They've got to kind of construct. I wouldn't say reconstruct. I'd say construct a kind of a conceptual meaning for any, for example, word or bit of culture. So the question arises, well, how do people get from signs to sort of having a convergent understanding of what those signs mean? So you could ask that question for word meanings. And that's something that we did. So I have a paper came out earlier this year with Chip Zuckerman, which is about kind of word meaning, but it's really focused on how words that refer to perceptual experience. In this case, it had to do with how people talk about the sounds they hear. How do those meanings get shared among groups of people who can't literally, share their internal experience of something? So I'm not going to go into all the details of the argument we made there, but I just want to pull out one or two kind of pieces of the mechanism that we talk about. So one of the key ideas, which I think is really crucial for cultural evolution, is this idea of stigmergy. So I'm just wondering, David, is this a kind of a term that you use?
I have heard it, but if you quiz me, I would do very poorly. So it's not
Fine. No, it's
totally.
fine.
So I'm eager to learn more.
Good. Yeah. So it's often used in
It's a social insect term. Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, it's a
now
social insect term.
I'm becoming grounded.
Yeah. So you encounter the term with social insects, things like flocking, swarming behavior, that kind of thing. But it's a very basic kind of idea, and it's represented here in this image with the so-called desire line, the kind of
Yeah.
path across the lawn. And the concept of stigmergy is that the behavior of other people leaves a trace.
Yes.
And then the trace becomes a sign, and then you engage in the same behavior. So like
Yes.
pheromone trails and architectural structures kind of give you instructions as a social being for kind of what you can do and how you can do it. So stigmergy is that idea. And in terms of learning, so if you look at word learning, one of the things that we quote in connection with this is Roger Brown's work. So he pioneered a lot of first language acquisition kind of work. And he gives the example of a biology professor introducing a word that the students have never heard. So he says the professor's new word functions as what he calls a lure to cognition. And so the idea is that he's saying, when you encounter a new piece of language or culture, and so that device I showed you an image of before would be an example of that. It attracts thought, as Brown put it, that makes you kind of want to know. what is that thing? And then it alerts you to look out for evidence in some sense. So this kind of gives you, when other people around you are engaged in linguistic practices or other kinds of practices, you're naturally, for a bunch of obvious reasons, you're naturally trying to fill in what that category would be. And this would be, what I call kind of conjecture, or what we might call a kind of an inferential process of trying to come up with a hypothesis to account for the kind of cultural behavior that you're seeing. So there's a few, the puzzle that we looked at in that paper that I mentioned from current anthropology was how is it that people can converge reasonably closely on their understandings of what a word might mean, or what a bit of culture might be, given that they're only relying on kind of publicly accessible information. So one of the kind of principles we talk about is what we call cumulative angulation. It's a very simple idea. It's just basically, having diverse forms of evidence that point to one thing. So our illustration is literally kind of triangulating. You're standing over here on the left. You're looking at this mountain. You know how high it is, but how far away is it? Well, you can't know that until you have another piece of information, which would be the angle from where you are to the top. And once you have that second piece of information, then you're able to triangulate and kind of infer or calculate something more about this. So if we look at it in a word learning context, I'll just give you this example. I've done linguistic descriptive work in Laos, in this case with an indigenous language called Cree in central Laos. And in doing that work, I'll just give you an example of one word that I was learning and kind of putting into my vocabulary list. So this word is bachai. And when I first learned this word, it was given to me in reference to where this man is standing. So he's standing on bachai. So, I wrote down in my notebook, well, this refers to a veranda, kind of like a balcony or something like that, right? However, after some time, I heard the word used in a different context, referring to these, bamboo poles lying on the ground, just in a different place. And then again later in reference to this stand of bamboo growing in by the riverside. So that immediately, it's a bit like the red chair problem from that Chomsky quote. It's like, what thing were they pointing at when they pointed at this, where this man is standing, and used that word? Well, they could have been pointing at a veranda, but they also could have been pointing at some bamboo, and it turned out it was the second thing. Now, it's a sort of, in a way, it's a kind of trivial example, but it illustrates that you need to get sort of diverse angles on something in order for you to sharpen your hypothesis, in a sense, of what that thing actually refers to. So the more diverse data points that you have on an object, the sharper the image of that thing becomes. All right, so I'm going to just kind of skip over this. It's just to point out that in that paper, which I can provide, Chip Zuckerman and I kind of go through a bunch of other elements as well, not just stigmergy and angulation, but other aspects of what we argue helps to get people to converge in a community on a common understanding of a in this case, a word, but it applies to culture more generally. So let me turn to a sort of second thing I wanted to talk about, which is, we're continuing on the same theme, but this now applies more to, artifacts and kind of material culture and technology. So this, I think, is a great example. The image that you see in front of you is a great example of how not to think about, technology and understanding aspects of culture. And that is the problem with the image that you see here, is that it is completely divorced from its surroundings and any kind of purpose or interaction with a kind of a greater what we might call relational frame. And I should say, just in brackets, you know, I was keen to have a discussion about relational frames here, because I'm not really au fait with relational frame theory, but it gives a name to something that's really important, I think, I'm about to talk about. So I'll be interested to know if this actually, you know, relates to relational frames as you all understand it. But before we get to that, what I want to do now is raise this kind of question about how this boat might have been caused. What causal process might have led to this boat being created? And so in a evolutionary kind of argument, the question is, you know, is it replicated? You know, what is the sort of causal process? Is it like kind of gene evolution, you know, or is it something different?
Nick,
so
Nick,
one
let
way
me
to think,
Nick, let me just break in a little bit. I've switched to
Yeah.
my iPhone. That's point one, so I'm still here. And secondly,
yep,
I just wanted to respond to your previous point. I think that this goes extremely well with relational frame theory, and here I think Lauren is our main representatives for RFT theory. So Lauren, a large weight is upon you, but of course we'll get everyone else involved in this too. But I see a huge connection, and so I'm excited about the opportunity to explore that in more detail. I just wanted to bookmark that before
right.
you continue.
Great. Yeah. I think we'll get more richly into that in just a second. So this question about what would cause this boat to be made is what we want to raise now. And from this Rogers and Ehrlich paper in PNAS 2007, they quote this early 20th century philosopher who says every boat is copied from another boat. And this is one way of thinking about kind of memetics, and it's one that, my colleague Peter Godfrey Smith here at Sydney has kind of educated me on this topic, and so I'm going to be citing him in a second. But there's a problem with this idea that every boat is copied from another boat, and I want to kind of get into that in 1 second. So two issues that arise from what I've discussed so far are, firstly, that now we're looking at a real image of a boat, okay, and we see a lot more than a boat. And what I'm hoping is that this really is an illustration of a whole set of relational frames. So a boat is, you see a boat here in this image, but it makes sense now because it is designed in such a way as to heed the affordances of water. It's designed in such a way as to heed the size and shape of the human body, and to incorporate and facilitate purposes and goals of the humans who designed them. So you see none of that in the first image, but you see it all here. You can readily see this woman, you know, is using this boat for the purpose that it was designed for, and so on and so forth. So to my mind, the way I talk about this image is really that there's a set of combinatorics where, you know, you don't understand the boat until you see that it's designed, you know, it has a combinatoric relationship with the human body, and it has a combinatoric relationship with water. That's what really a boat is. It has to include those things. Otherwise, you don't understand what a boat is. So the image shows, firstly, that to understand a boat, you have to understand that whole set of relationships. That's an important thing I want to just put on the table here now. And then the second thing, which we'll get straight into, is the question of whether we copy individual boats or not. So that quotation before said, you know, we copy, you know, every boat's a copy of another boat. If you take that claim literally and seriously, I don't think it holds up. And I think it's important. There's an important reason for that. It has to do with what I was saying before about how we conjecture hypotheses about what kind of signs stand for. So I'm going to cite Dan Sperber's work on this. So he has a chapter in the book called Darwinizing Culture, I think it's called, from 2000. And he has this little thought experiment. I don't think he actually ran this experiment, but he has a thought experiment where he says, the meme idea, according to some, is that, that you copy stuff. Okay, so like a boat is copied from another boat. And so he says, take this weird looking squiggle on the screen and do an experiment where you look at it carefully and then you try to remember exactly. And then 10 minutes later, you get to make a copy, you give it to someone else, same again. You do that 10 times and you'll get mutations or you'll get sort of errors being introduced and this shape will change. But the key thing he said is that you should be able to reconstruct the order in which the drawings were done, because you'd get small mutations from one to the next to the next. And that's because this image doesn't have any meaning, it doesn't have any function. It's just you're just copying the surface form. So this would be on what I call the y-axis. So you've got just a sign and an interpreter, and it's just a copy. There's no orientation to an underlying kind of concept. He doesn't speak in these terms, but this is how I'm interpreting it. So then he says, totally different thing would be to give this image to the people in the experiment and say, okay, now give the exact same instruction. I want you to copy this exactly. And, you look at it, and then 10 minutes later, you get to do the, you get to draw it and then pass it on. And he says, or he predicts that if you ran this as a formal experiment, you wouldn't be able to reconstruct the order in which they were done. And the reason is they're not copies of each other. They're all generated by the same underlying kind of recipe, which is the concept of a 5-pointed star drawn without lifting the pen off the paper. So what he's saying is you recognize this drawing as an instance of that, and then you work off the underlying kind of concept. And just to sort of anticipate what I'm going to say later is that's how it works with boats. You don't copy the boat. You might copy certain aspects of the boats, but underlyingly you have a theory of what boats are, how they work, how they should work, and you have a whole range of data that you've brought together over time. Okay. So I'll get to that. We'll get back to boats in a second, but this exercise about drawing and copying is really interesting. And there's some work I wrote about in my book, 2022 book, Language versus Reality. I wrote about these experiments that were done 100 years ago by the Gestalt theory people who were looking at how people remember kind of abstract line drawings. So here's some examples you can see on the screen of these experiments from the early 20s, where people were given just abstract figures to remember and copy later. So exactly the same kind of idea as what we just suggested, just not iterated. And in this experiment, Wolf just remarked in passing that people, when they did this experiment, they would often remark on what they thought the image resembled. And so not long afterwards, Gibson did an experiment based on this, where he tried to actually create kind of ambiguous figures, and then he tried to encourage people to talk about what they thought they saw. And then he related what they said to what kind of errors they made or what errors they introduced in the reproduction of these images, right? So on the left, in this example, you see what Gibson originally gave to the subjects. And then on the right of the line here, you see a few different redrawings from memory. And you can see, you can predict, knowing what I've just told you, the kind of words that these people used when they described the original image. So the person who said, oh yeah, it's like an arrow, when later they had to draw it, they didn't copy the thing they saw, they drew an arrow. Or over here, if they said, oh yeah, it's like a star, they didn't really copy the thing they drew, they just drew a star. So this invokes this whole kind of process of what's called verbal overshadowing, where if you've decided to categorize something, you end up throwing out information and not working from the experience you had, but working from, your conject, the kind of the underlying kind of conceptual structure that is generating now is taken over. as the generative force for the interpreter that you're producing. So yeah, I mean, maybe I won't get into any more detail kind of about this, but there was this further follow-up study, 1932 study by Carmichael et al., where they controlled this. Instead of just letting people talk freely, they actually took ambiguous images. So these are the stimulus figures were in the middle here. So just look at the bottom ones. They give everybody this ambiguous figure in the middle, the two circles with the line between. And if they referred to that as eyeglasses when they presented it to subjects for copying later, people would tend to put this little bend in the line here. So it was introduced not by anything they perceived in the original stimulus, but introduced by the conject, by the underlying concept that they had. And for the other half of the group who were told, yeah, copy these dumbbells, they tended to put in a thicker middle line because that fits with the image that they had of dumbbells, and so on for all these other ambiguous figures. So this was, this is a study that looks at the effects of word meanings, but I think it illustrates the power of this kind of the underlying inference that you've made about what something is and what it's for later, how you then deploy that concept, or how that concept affects the way you think or act later on. Good. So this is just to kind of reiterate or restate the kind of point I made earlier on, and that's to say that I think that in thinking about cultural transmission, cultural evolution, we've really got to think about simultaneously about these two axes. The idea that a sign has a meaning, stands for something, and the idea that a sign gives rise to an interpreter in a kind of temporal causal context. That we want to think about both of those simultaneously, and the way to do that is to draw in this line where interpretants are oriented to objects as much as they are to the visible signs, and that's the semiotic process that I'm interested in here. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly, but I just want to make a kind of last point that takes us more to kind of cultural evolution. This is a quote from Dan Dennett. This is from Darwin's Dangerous Idea at some point where he's talking about memes. He says, a wagon with spoked wheels carries not only grain from place to place, it carries the brilliant idea of a wagon with spoked wheels from mind to mind. And I want to kind of just say a couple of things about this. So one thing I want to say is, I very much agree, and I think it's a really important point that, the use that we have of any kind of, object or piece of technology, which could include a way of talking, it doesn't only have a function, but it advertises itself. And that potentially increases its own frequency, and particularly if, the various transmission biases lead it to be adopted more readily. So this image that you see here, I think, is very much like the boat image that I showed earlier, where you have a very rich relational frame, if you like, where it's not just a cartwheel, spoked wheels, but you can see why people have them. You can see what people are doing with them, the relationship between the load and the wheels, the relationship between the physical structure and the bodies of human beings, the relationship between all of that and the goals and the activities that people are engaging in. That is what the wagon with spoked wheels actually is. It's not just the physical object. And a big problem, I think, with thinking about cultural evolution is just focusing on the physical artifact. And so now, we'll come to the device I showed at the very beginning of the talk, but that's the problem with that device, is that you never encounter a device in that way on a white background with no information about what it's for. So I want to quote John von Neumann here. He's got this work on self-reproducing systems and automata and so on, and he has this nice line about the idea that a system can be self-reproducing only if it contains its own plan, if it contains its own description in some sense. So there's an obvious way in which, I guess DNA can be thought of in that way, that it's a description of the organism in some sense. And so, cells contain their own plan in that sense. But how do we apply that to culture? Well, I think coming back now to this image of the boat, it contains its own plan, not if you look just at the physical boat. It contains its own plan when you look at the real thing, which is this constellation of things. The way the water combines rightfully with the boat, the way the person combines rightfully with the boat, the way the person is, oriented to the water, etc. That's where the plan or the description of the boat is it's completely visible in its normal in the normal kind of contexts in which you encounter them. So children in this village see boats being used in this way. They never see boats. Sometimes they see boats being used for planting pot plants in them. That's another conversation we could have. But in general, they see them like this. All right. So coming back to this idea that boats are copies of other boats, let me quote Peter Godfrey Smith here, who says, "You might spend a year deciding exactly which boat to copy, but then copy it in every detail, including features that have no apparent adaptive rationale." You might do that. But he's saying, in contrast, you might attend in diverse ways to several models, tracking failure as well as success, and using other boats as prompts to intelligent tinkering. So that, to my mind, points to all of the kind of causal and spatial and functional relations that the object we call a boat would be part of. And that points to the difference between the two little images that Sperber asks us to look at. So in that context, I would just want to underline that transmission biases are going to be important in this whole thing. So I've written somewhat about this in relation to language change, and I won't say anything more about this, but very happy to talk about them anytime. So I think that in the context of these I-axis kind of sequences, what Dan Sperber would call cognitive causal chains, you've got a whole range of transmission biases, content biases, context biases, model biases, but also crucially normative biases. So if you
Okay, go ahead.
If you do something that let's say you do something with a boat that is not what people normally do with boats, like I said before, you can put dirt in them and plant plants in them. The normative environment will be such that people are going to be likely to be surprised by that, to sanction that. It's not necessarily a problem, but they will rationalize it in some way. So they'll figure, oh, that's probably a boat that's no longer, seaworthy. So we'll just plant plants in it, and so forth. Good. So the mystery gadget, it's for slicing avocados. And maybe you knew that, but I didn't. This is from Peter Richardson and Rob Boyd's 2005 book, Not by Genes Alone. And they're kind of making a similar point to this one. And the idea here is that, if you saw this object lying, well, where would you see it? Like, we probably all, if you ask students, like, what is this thing? They can actually tell you quite a lot. They can tell you, well, it's meant to be grabbed by the hand. It looks like it's kind of probably would belong in a kitchen, something like that. But beyond that, you don't know. But as soon as you see this image, it all falls into place. And, that gives you, I suppose, what we might call a relational frame for understanding this thing. And that's what people actually get exposed to, not just these disembodied instruments. So this idea of inheritance by conjecture is what I've been describing today, thinking about how you've got to infer somehow what rationalizes the signs and the interpretants that they that they invite or elicit. Interpretants are responses, but they're not just mechanical responses. They're rational in the sense I've been describing, and all of those things are oriented to material. So they're oriented to signs, that is to sounds, and physical environments. The last piece of what I've kind of been thinking about is something I'm not going to say anything about in any detail today, but just to let you know that these are kind of a big part of what I think follows from all of what I've been saying. That is that we've been looking at disembodied, or no, that's not the right word. We've been looking at fragments of language or culture today. I just gave you the example of one word, or the example of a boat, but of course these are items within much greater systems. And so there's a whole puzzle, which is how do these items that can be detached from their cultural context or their linguistic context, how do they become parts of structured systems? That's something I've been kind of working on, and more recently is the question of, given just the vast possibility space of what you might have in a language or in a cultural context or in a technosphere, why is it that we sort of use such a thin slice of that set of possibilities? So sound systems in language would be an example of that. The possible set of sounds that languages can use is of much, much, much greater than any individual language actually uses. And so there's an interesting question around, why are we so selective in kind of cultural complexes? So yeah, just to conclude then, the idea here is that if it's possible to inherit culture, it's not through direct copying, it's through conjecture. It's based on trying to kind of accumulate evidence and think about, and build hypotheses about the meaning of what we see as a way of both interpreting what we see, but also generating action that's going to be effective and going to be understood in the future, and not kind of disconfirmed by the evidence in the environment around us. So I'll leave it there, and I'd be very happy to have any kind of questions and discussion here and now, or as many of you